Hey, hello everybody. So welcome back again. And let's see. So today, what we're going to do is we're going to have a discussion on data collection. Kind of been looking through kind of our list of topics that we should be covering, and so I'm going to move ahead. This week we are listed as supposed to be doing the hypothesis, but we did cover that last week. And I would like to go ahead and get into the data collection here this week. And the reason for that, I'll explain it more in detail in the second hour. But basically the reason for that is in looking through the math of how to work out everybody's presentation. What I would like to do is give everyone the ability to do around 25-30 minutes worth of presenting. That would include question and answers. That'd be your entire time. So in order to do that, we're gonna have to get to presentations sooner than I originally thought because of some holiday stuff. So like I said, I'll talk about that more in detail in the second hour because there's some stuff related to that I want to discuss with you guys. So stick around. But for now, let's get right into our discussion on data collection. My plan is, as usual, what I would like to do is go ahead and initialize with some a slide presentation. You know, the slides that are available on the shared drive, but then also save some time for discussion. Because again, I think the best way for us to sometimes learn these things is to learn from others. All right, and so many of you again have done experiments. You've gone through this process of data collection, and so we can talk through your experience and how that was done. Okay, so basically, what is data collection? Well, there's a couple of different types of data collection. Data collection can be defined as either primary or secondary. Primary data is that which we collect ourselves. So it's data that we gain through. It could be through experiments, as we'll see. The text is really heavy on kind of behavioral sciences. And even like medical could fall into this, and so it's going to have a lot of the text has a lot of emphasis on getting data from human, especially, but from human and animal subjects. And so I know that doesn't really apply to computer science a lot of times, but as we learned last week and as we've learned in the previous weeks, and when some of you shared, notably, I'm remembering when Meli shared about his thesis, that even though we are in the technical field, maybe writing software or creating some type of computer system for some things, that doesn't mean that we don't branch out into those other arenas. So like Meli's research having to do with eye segmentation and being able to use digital resources to be able to analyze a human eye, right? So that kind of overlaps into that medical field. All right. So anyway, but primary data is stuff that we do ourselves. Secondary data would be something collected from another source. All right, so we don't run the experiments, but we use the data that was collected through some other source, through an experiment or through, as we'll talk about here in today, other means as well, through interviews and stuff like that. So primary data, it can be collected. We can run experiments that will determine aspects of the world, the universe. I mean, it can fall into multiple types of fields. It could be related to economics, psychological, medical, computer-based fields as well as technological. Right, and so we can run experiments to determine what those truths are, what those relationships between different variables and different unknowns are. We can also study those that exist, those relationships that exist through surveys. Now, of course, obviously, surveys would be dependent on the thing being studied being cooperative with the person or group being studied, being cooperative with our surveys. But it could be that there's a relationship that exists and we tease that out. We gain that knowledge through asking questions and through and don't think surveys just like asking questions. It could be any type of survey of observation. Okay, so in fact, the very first method that we'll talk about, the observation method, all right, is that where we can observe some system or something in action. So it could be, there's lots of different ways that we can do observation. We could be an external observer that's not really a participant of what's going on. We could also be an internal observer, a participant in the group that we are studying. In fact, I remember, well, we'll talk about this, but I remember a news, what's it called? A news report or an interview. Is a documentary. That's what it is. That's the word I'm looking for. A documentary on a guy who studied a particular group, and the way that he studied them was by kind of getting down into that group. Okay. We can also talk about the interview method, questionnaires, schedules, and then these others. We won't go into detail on those, but these are all out there and available. These are all options for how we might collect primary data. The observation method could also, that would also be what they're talking about here, could also be a form of experiment as well. An experiment would be a type of observation method in a sense. Okay. All right. So some of the different I'm on one slide ahead actually in my head. So the observation method is most commonly used. And again, like I said, this particular text seems to be pretty heavy on behavioral sciences, but it can be used as well in our own fields, in other fields as well. But basically the concept is we're always observing stuff, right? We're always taking note of things that are happening around us and sometimes making connections, when they're not there, but sometimes we observe those things around us and we make connections and we say, oh, well, this happened, then this other thing happened, and so therefore, oh, that maybe that first thing somehow caused the second thing, which that's if we make that without other evidence, if we just say, oh, A happened and then B happened after that therefore A caused B, if we just make that assumption like that, that's what's called, there's a logical fallacy in that is the idea that correlation is not always causation. And so just because two things are correlated doesn't mean that one caused the other. There's a lot of information out there on that, and I encourage you to make sure that you understand how to better understand the things that are correlated because of causation, because one thing caused another. But anyway, basically the idea is when we take a systematic approach to our observation, then it becomes a scientific tool. See, observation on its own is something we all do as human beings. We all sit here and observe what's going on. You guys are sitting at your computer right now. You're observing this class, right? Some of you may be doing other things at the same time. Some of you may, I'm hoping that none of you are watching YouTube at the same time, but I'm fully aware that may be going on, right? But you are observing this class. You're making notes in your mind of the words that I'm saying. When I'm on screen, you look at me, I think, and right now you're looking at a slide, right? You're making observations about what's going on. But when we stop just doing random observation and we say, okay, I am going to systematically take notes of specific things. I'm going to, in an experiment situation, maybe in a controlled experiment, I'm going to apply a variable. I'm going to take a variable and change its value, or I'm going to, let's say in a medicinal, like a medicine or vaccine or something like that study, we might say, I'm going to take this vaccine or this medicine and I'm going to give it to a patient, and I'm going to specifically observe what happens as a result. I'm going to formulate, okay, I'm going to take, let's say we're studying, I have high cholesterol, right? So I take cholesterol medicine for my high cholesterol. At some point when that medicine was being developed, they gave that medicine, they likely gave that medicine to one group of patients who had high cholesterol. They gave a, what's it called? A medicine that doesn't do anything. A placebo, right? They gave a placebo to some group of people as well. And what they did, yeah, thank you, Seth. And what they did was they said, okay, let's look at the cholesterol values of our variable group before we give them any medicine, and let's look at the cholesterol readings of those of everyone after the medicine has been applied. And I'm assuming, based on the fact that this is what the doctor has prescribed for me, and the fact that the pharmacy, keeps it available and I can buy it from them, I'm assuming that what happened as a result of the study involving this medication was that the variable group ended up with lower cholesterol values after the study than the control group did. All right, that's my assumption. Obviously I haven't read up on it. The fact that it's available makes me think that. Okay, but the whole point is we're listing out what are we going to observe. Did they need to observe how many of the people in the variable group and the control group, how many of them drove certain types of vehicles? Well, no, that's not really something that they need to observe as a part of that study, right? Or now some other things they might choose to observe and would be good would be what type of diet, right? What type of food were each group eating before and after? Was anyone in the control group or the variable group, did they start going to the gym, to the fitness merkezi? Did they start going to the gym during the study? Well, that would definitely affect the outcome, right? And so, but those are all things that they would say, I'm going to observe these things and I'm going to record these things. Okay. The advantage of an observation method when it is a scientific approach, when we systematically set up how we're going to observe things, is that we can remove the bias, right? If it's done well. Now, obviously, we are human beings, and bias is always going to be something that exists. It's going to be impossible, if not nearly impossible, to completely get rid of any bias, because even the things that we choose to observe will be somewhat biased, right? But if we can, as much as possible, remove bias, then we can get accurate understandings of how different things are related. Okay. Some different types of observation: structured versus unstructured. And really what I should have done is done this as kind of a verse, like not verses, but slash, maybe one on each line. So the participant versus non-participant, this one that I was talking about a moment ago. So there was a documentary I saw, and this was years ago. This was something like 20 years ago. I watched this documentary, and it was about this guy that for his PhD thesis, he studied. So in America, we have what's called, well, not just in America, it's in other places too, but America has this groups that are called white supremacist groups. And what this PhD student in sociology, I think, what he did for his thesis was he actually kind of went undercover and joined one of these groups to kind of observe them, to be able to understand why did they think the way they did and why did they do things the way that they did. And so that would have been a participant type of observation. Was he didn't come in and tell them, hey, I'm a guy that wants to study your group to understand why do you think the way that you do about, minorities and other people, right? And he wanted to get an accurate understanding. And I think for him, he felt that if he came in as an outsider, they may not be as willing to be fully honest and fully open with him about some of the details of who they were, right? And for the things that he wanted to study. But as coming in as a quote insider person here, then he could really observe. He could really observe how they functioned and how they interacted and some of those things. It's very interesting. If I can find an interview with the guy. Again, I watched this thing like 20 years ago. I was probably your age. For those of you in this group, I was probably your age when I saw it. So, so it was a long time ago. The other option besides participant is non-participant. It's like an outsider, kind of saying, "Look, I'm part of." Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that those being observed know that they're being observed. I mean, if you're like one of the old tropes that we talk about in scientific study is the whole rats in a maze, like mice running a maze to study things. Obviously, that's a non-participant type of, a researcher cannot become a mouse and go into the maze, right? And the mice are, as far as we know, they're unaware that they're being observed for the purposes of scientific study, right? So those being observed don't necessarily know that they're being observed, but sometimes they are. So in the case of a medical study, like with a medicine or vaccine, like we talked about before, that could be a type of non-participant observation where the researcher is not personally taking the medicine, not personally injecting themselves with the vaccine the vaccine being studied, but they are observing those who are. Okay, so I'll skim through the next ones because a lot of them are related to human studies, but they are important and they are good for. So some of you have taken my database class actually, and you know that we talked through this about what actually just did this week. Actually did this class on Monday about fact-finding techniques. So this is very similar to fact-finding techniques, right? So the interview method basically is you ask questions, and get answers. This can be how we learn about side effects of medicine, right? So if you've ever seen a medicine advertisement, it's like, oh, this medicine lowers cholesterol, but the side effects are lots of side effects, right? Well, how do we find out about those side effects? Well, what oftentimes is that we need our participants to respond to, okay, what did you experience now that you didn't experience before taking the medicine, right? And so that could be done through an interview. That could be a question as part of an interview. One of the nice things about interview, especially face-to-face, and I added this one, the video chat, is you can pick up on body language. And so if someone gives an answer, but the answer doesn't necessarily match the body language, or tone of voice could be a big thing as well, then the interviewer, if they're, on top of things, can follow up with other questions. All right. A questionnaire. You guys do questionnaires. Well, I'm assuming you guys will also, but I know that this university sends out a questionnaire every semester, that when you take a course, you get a questionnaire sent to you through the OBS system, right? And so the respondent, the person being questioned, will complete it and return it. Obviously, there's some good advantages. It's less expensive to do this than an interview because it doesn't take up as much time on the part of the interviewer. But it can also have some disadvantages. What if people don't fill it out completely, or fill it out with like bad information? The example I always use this example with my students when this comes up, because it's really important to me, actually. So one of the questions on the questionnaire, I can't remember the exact way it's worded, but it's like, do you have any additional comments, or do you have something like that? It's a text field, right? Especially for Seth, you're talking about for like a multiple choice type thing. If there's no appropriate response, I don't like any of them, right? Yeah, exactly. And then, but for like a text-based response, like, do you have any additional comments, or what comments would you like to make, to the professor, whatever. It's written something like that. And I figured out that the university has decided to make this question a required answer, right? And the way I figured that out is because every student types something into that field. But the problem is that, and I'm going to type some examples here of some comments that I've gotten on my own reviews. So this is one answer I've gotten. This is another one. That's another one. All right. And so what I figured out is that the system must require something to be written, that any student that has ever tried to just leave it blank and click submit, the response they got back from OBS was, you can't leave that field blank. And so in their rush to hurry up and get to their grades, because I also know from talking to other students that you're not allowed to see your grades until you fill this form out, that in their rush to get to see their grades, is they just type something quick like this. All right. Now, for me, as a teacher, these comments are very, very much not helpful, right? I don't learn anything about what I've done as a teacher through comments like this. Actually, it's funny because even a comment like this, even a comment like that, which quite frankly has happened much less frequently than the other three examples I gave just now, but it has happened. But even that comment is not very helpful, right? I thank you for, whoever writes this, I thank you for the compliment, right? But I want to know, what can I improve? What did you not like about the way that I taught a certain class, right? What did a student like? What is it something that I should make sure that I continue to do because this student was very much helped to learn the material because of something I did in the class, all right? So those things, right? So that's why they have that comment there. But this is a downside, right? So these examples here I've given, it's a downside, a disadvantage of the questionnaire is sometimes, we can't follow up, right? And especially because if like the wording is a big thing, especially for any students who don't understand the wording of a question. It could be because the English is hard to understand. It could be because it could be because the question just wasn't worded very well. It was worded in a way that the researcher could understand it clearly, but the person being questioned has a harder time understanding it. Like it could be just that the wording is not something that the person reading it normally uses. I give this example pretty frequently. When my family and I lived in Ankara, and I was learning Turkish. I was taking Turkish classes, and they taught us the standard, merhaba, merhaba, nasılsın, iyiyim, what else was it? Adın ne? Benim adım Joseph. What was the next one? The one that I'm getting to is, nerelisin, right? The next question, nerelisin, Amerikalıyım, and these are the things that they taught us in the class. Well, after a few weeks, or I don't remember how long, of taking Turkish classes, I went out to the bazaar, and I was buying, nice fruits and vegetables. The bazaar here is so great. All right. And one of the guys there is, merhaba, nasılsın? İyiyim. Memleketin nedir? And I'm like, what? And he says it again. Memleketin nedir? Like, I have no clue what that means. Right? Why? Because that wasn't a word I had been taught yet. Generally it meant the same thing as nerelisin, right? He was asking, where are you from? Right? But I didn't know that because that wasn't a word that I was used to hearing in my language class. And so in the same way, if a question on a questionnaire uses a word or wording that the person responding is not used to, does not know, that could be a big problem for them, right? Okay. So the schedules are like questionnaire, but with assistance from an enumerator who will come along and help them to fill out the questionnaire. All right. Then there's other methods as well. Like I said, we won't spend a lot of time there. Now, secondary data just is other data that's out there. It could be in journal publications. It could be a database. It may not be something that's published in a journal publication or a book or something like that. It could be just information that's out there in some type of database. So, for example, there's lots of countries right now are keeping lots of data on how this virus is interacting with people's bodies, with the vaccine, with how cases, what types of conditions are. There's a word they use for it, a secondary condition that someone has that comorbidities. That's the word I saw in an interview the other day. So they're keeping information about what comorbidities. That's a word that means like someone died and they had COVID, so they tested positive for COVID and they died, but they also had, asthma. They also had some type of vitamin deficiency. They also had something else. And so there's all this information that these governments and nations are keeping, and hospitals and stuff are keeping track of, not published. Like, this is data that's in a database. It's not published out there in publications. Maybe some of the summary of it is, but the specific information is not. And we can get access to those. If you can get access to those, if your purpose is studying something related to the COVID pandemic, then you could get access to those databases and to those that type of information. Okay? And this might be, that would likely not be public records, right? But because health statistics are not public. In fact, I don't know here about Turkey, but in America we have something called the HIPAA law that has to do with privacy in medical information, privacy and health information. So I don't know if Turkey has that or not. Some of you might know. All right. So some of the secondary data characteristics that we need to make sure that the data is reliable, it's suitable, because just because something's reliable doesn't mean it's suitable to what we're studying. If we're studying Seth, you're studying journal publications and how to accurately predict or how to accurately suggest an appropriate journal for a publication. You don't probably need a lot of reliable COVID pandemic information for that, right? And so make sure that we have a suitable information. What is appropriate for what we are studying? Right. Yeah. Right. So in fact, let me just finish this up, and then I'm going to come back here, and Seth, I'm going to have you talk about that then. Okay. All right. Make sure that as you're considering how you're going to obtain secondary data, some of the considerations we need to take into account, the nature, the scope, and object of what we are inquiring about. Funds, do we have the availability? Because some things are not free, so accesses to certain journal repositories won't be free. Time factor, there is a ton of information out there, right? There's more. In fact, there's a joke, right? There's a joke about people who quote unquote reach the end of the internet, or even just reach the end of YouTube, right? That it's like that could never happen. It would take so long and so much, right? And so there's a ton of information available. We need to make sure that we sift through it in an efficient manner, in a reasonable manner. And what is the precision required? Something that I've read up on and would like to study talks about the idea of the complex adaptive systems. Talks about how sometimes things may look random, but precision, they may not be the exact same. So, or actually, let me give a better example that you guys, all of you in this meeting, should understand. We often talk about in testing code, not to test for if you have a double value, a decimal value, not to test for equality. Right? If x equals 0.1, that kind of thing. And the reason why is because the way that computer systems store floating point numbers, right? So we always suggest that you just check within a certain amount of precision, within a certain amount of decimal places, and so that would be the question there. That would be, what type of precision do we need in some of our data we're looking for? Okay. One final point to be made before I'm going to open this up for some discussion is the idea of a case study. So a case study could be a smaller unit of a larger group that we can study. Let's say, I'll just tell you my example. It's not a person, a family, or group, or anything like that. So for my thesis, what I studied was what's called model transformation. It's transforming computer models from one paradigm into another. So specifically, long-term goal was to transform models written in Simulink, that's MATLAB Simulink, and ultimately we would like to have a process that would transform them into models in Repass, which is an agent-based modeling platform. So what my particular research had to do with was taking the Simulink model and transforming it into a platform independent model. And there's a whole lot that comes along with that. But basically, we studied a smaller model, not very small, but it did not incorporate every known block in Simulink, every known functionality in Simulink. But it was this simulator that simulated robots playing football. For those of you not from America, right? And we studied that particular model to help us get an understanding of how models were stored in Simulink. And so we were able to successfully bring that into what's called a platform independent representation, SysML, which is kind of a offshoot of UML, and then bring it back into Simulink as well. Now, we didn't cover all of Simulink's potential functionality. We didn't cover all of their blocks, but we did cover certain blocks that were used a high percentage of the time across all models of Simulink. So we were using that as a case study to say, let's look at this example to get an idea of how Simulink works in general. All right, and then we can apply that to other models as well. And then as we learn more about how some of the other blocks in Simulink function and how the other functionality works, then we could modify our transformation process. So a case study is saying, okay, let's look at some example of like a subset, learn some things from that, and then come up with general rules that we could apply to the whole. And obviously, as we incorporate more from the whole, from the larger group into our study, then we can modify our conclusions along the way. All right, but it's kind of getting like a baseline understanding based on a smaller example. Okay. All right. So, like I said, I wanted to open this up. We've got about 10 minutes until our normal break time. So, Seth, you had mentioned that you used a lot of secondary data, and you found these three, the reliability, suitability, and adequacy, very important. So explain, how did you ensure these things, and how did you check for these things?
Okay, so for the adequacy, I knew that the data was adequate because I was able to get results. So that served kind of like as a check to make sure that it was enough data. And for the suitability, the data contained information that was not needed. And so I had to consider, do I get rid of some of the data that I don't need, or do I keep it in there? Because if I keep it in there, I can just ignore it. But if I get rid of it, that can save space, resources and such. So for reliability, that was like the most important one. And I had to check that all the data was structured correctly. I had found some of the data was not, like in some certain field in the database had the wrong values and things. So I had to fix all of these things. And then there's so yeah, how to explain. The data was complicated, and how can I be sure that the model was picking up on the right things, what I wanted it to distinguish, rather than distinguishing something else? I don't know how to explain that, but reliability was very important. Having the right information in the right places to not lead to a failure of the models. Okay.
Cool. All right, thank you. Well, that's a good question. All right, so actually, I just had the I just had the honor of reading through a paper written by Meli who's in the class, and he used synthetic data in their study, right? Like generated data.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. So what do you think? Is that considered a primary or a secondary data source?
I think synthetic data can be considered as a secondary data source because it's not as quality as a real eye images, and their representation is simpler than real world scenarios, but they can be used to improve our results, but they cannot be used as the single source of research.
Mm. Right, because if it's biomedical, then you would have to have real data, right? Not synthetically produced in order to get accurate results, right?
That's correct.
Newman, it's an interesting question because it also, in some sense, I would think some of that data, even if it was actual bio data, like so in the case of Meli, even those pictures of actual eyes, not synthetically produced pictures of eyes, but actual eyes, even that was not, if they were not collected by you, if they were stored in some repository or some cloud data storage someplace, then I think that I would consider that to be secondary, because it was not something that was collected by you initially, but it was collected by some other source and stored in some location.
I think I agree with that because when we were collecting the data for the research, we needed to take permission from the patients and parents of the patients. So we sort of needed to take permission from the ethic committee. So there were lots of formalities going on with the data we collected, but from the outside, even if the outside data were also taken from the other humans, I didn't bother with the certain procedures. I just collected them with the promise of I will use them for the research. Most of the time, biometric data is protected by some sort of rules. They say that you cannot use it for other than the scientific research.
Right. That would make sense. Yeah. So did you get some mixture then? So did you get some pictures of eyes directly, like on your own? Like, did you take those pictures, or did someone in your group take those pictures, or was it all collected from some secondary source?
We collected them all by ourselves. Me and my colleagues collected them. We created a certain setup in order to collect the eye data, and we created a simple device to collect them. But it's in a way really interesting topic because collecting data is sort of, even if you get a permission, it's sort of, invading someone's privacy because that data can be later used in harmful ways. So
Yeah. Yeah, could be.
Erdinç also collected intensi, I think, yeah, I'm using the right word, intensi data from the patients. They listened the internal organs of the patients to get whether the small intestine is working or not. Maybe he can also add something to the subject.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, I also collect some data in the hospital. Actually, it took more than 6 months. But for my we worked on synthetic data. So there were studies to generate bowel movement signals. Sorry, the signals of bowel movement. So we use that method to generate both noise and bowel sounds. So also we generated random noises. So I personally used scientific data in my thesis. Yeah.
So you got primary data. So you got actual recordings yourself. Like you went to the hospital and made recordings yourself.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So kind of but you used a mix there because you also had some, I'm assuming, some secondary data in there as well.
I had to generate a secondary, synthetic data because I started to test my algorithm after pandemic. So there was an error while collecting the data, so I had to regenerate data.
Wow.
So I couldn't go to the hospital that time. So.
Wow. All right. Well, thank you guys. So we got a good kind of a mix here of at least what I understand, what I hear, based on what Seth, Melly, and Erdinch have shared is we got kind of a good mix of Seth used entirely secondary data for his work because because what his work was related to was taking abstracts from papers and being able to accurately suggest an appropriate journal for them to go to, for them to be submitted to. And so he didn't take the time to write all those abstracts himself, right? He used them based on a repository of existing journal papers, right? And so that was entirely secondary data since he didn't write any of those abstracts himself. Although I do think, didn't you use your own abstract as the seed to a to the system to see what journal it would suggest?
Not as a seed, but just as a
not as a seed, but as a test, rather.
yeah, as a test. Mine and a couple of others. All the data is real world data, and so this wasn't actually necessary, but just as kind of a sanity check, I decided to try it and see what the results were.
Gotcha. Yeah. So, right. But as far as the training of the model, he used nothing but secondary data. Yeah. So you guys are having this discussion about I mean, if you have a huge amount of data, all right, how can you check the reliability of it all? So, I would say it depends on the source, right? So, I mean, just even if you looked at like across all news outlets right now, based on stories of something going on in the world, you might have, tons of articles that say things that aren't true, right? But if but we can look to the ones who have good editorial review processes to try to figure out maybe what a better option would be. In some ways, Mehmet Ali, that's kind of an ethical question more than a technical one, and so because it is, how do you trust the truthfulness of and the objectivity objectivity of the ones collecting it. Yeah, that's a good question. One I do not have a direct answer to. So, all right. Well, we ran a little bit over of our first hour, so let's go ahead and take a break. Grab a cup of water, some tea, coffee, whatever helps you stay awake through these things, and we will come back in 10 minutes. And we'll move on into an ethical discussion. And in fact, based on truthfulness. Like how do you know we're going to go into that bullet point on the ethical. I can't remember what it's called. It's the code of ethics. The code of ethics for engineers. And we're going to go into another bullet point about stating things in an objective and truthful manner. So good question to lead us into that, Mehmet Ali, and we'll see all of you in 10 minutes, and we'll continue on from there.